wrong body, that she was a boy, and that had been the case ever since early childhood. So maybe she'd be speaking as a teenager. Now, you make the claim in your book that girls who go online, who are searching for information about transgender identity, often encounter coaches who tell them to falsify their personal narrative and to claim that they've always been gender dysphoric, despite the fact that that's not the case. Is that a reasonable summary of what you found?
Yes.
So you can see that it's a complete diagnostic mess from a therapist's perspective, and even from a conceptual perspective, because the people who are on the other side of the argument than you, let's say, are going to claim that the reason that these rates have skyrocketed to the point where they're at now is because there were always that many people who had gender dysphoria or who were transgender, but the weight of public opinion was held so strongly against them that they had to stay in the closet, essentially, and were unable to adopt their true identity. And the claim is going to be made as well that you're radically exaggerating the proportion of people who are putting themselves forward for transgender transition procedures, let's say, who have been coached.
Right. Okay. So let me respond to a few of those things. First of all, I don't think that's right. I think that, I mean, I agree with you that that's what they would say, but I've thought about that claim because, and here's what I would say in response. If this were just, as they say, a natural reversion, now that there's greater societal acceptance of transgender people, that they would say, oh, you would expect to see a natural reversion to what we're seeing now, which they might claim is a normal base rate of transgender identification in the population. The problem with that is, number one, we're only seeing this sudden spike among teenage girls. Where are the women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s who were denied the opportunity to come out as transgender? They should be coming out too, but they're not.
Can you also point out, I guess the other thing that you might conclude is that if the bulk of the proportion of people who were claiming a transgender identity in the past were male, then release of the social strictures on identification should have produced an explosion in males. It's not easy to figure out why there is an explosion in females. Right. Okay, so that leads us to another extremely troublesome topic, which is why the explosion in teenage females. Now, you do attempt to explain that in your book, and so maybe you could outline for the listeners exactly what your conclusions were.
Sure. Teenage girls are famous for falling for every hysteria, right? We know that the way young women, and there are psychologists who've done wonderful work in this area, Amanda Rose is one of the University of Missouri, who I interviewed. Teenage girls tend to spread these psychic epidemics because their modes of friendship involve co-rumination, taking on their friend's pain. They like to rehash their own pain, and they like to take on their friend's pain. And they are even willing to suspend reality in order to sort of get on the team of their friend. Okay?
So would it be, I'm being a real son of a bitch in this interview to some degree, because I've been trying to think up all the objections I possibly could to your perspective because it's so contentious. And so I'm going to put forward things that I'm thinking about that are critiques. And it's not that I'm believing them, but they need to be brought forward. So a skeptic might say that you are relying on stereotypes of feminine behavior in adolescence to justify your claim that it's girls that are susceptible to a kind of hysteria, and that's an outdated and sexist, I suppose, hypothesis.
No, I'm not relying on stereotypes at all. I'm relying on evidence. If you look at the anorexia, it afflicts one population. If you look at bulimia, it afflicts one population, and it grows and it spreads among friend groups, just as this does. It's young women encouraging each other in self-harm. And if you look at cutting, same thing. And clinicians have known for years that you cannot house anorexics together in a hospital ward without being very careful, because they will encourage each other to lose more and more weight. We know that women
right, and you see that online with
this.
regards to anorexia, right, with the pro-ana sites and the pro-bulimia sites.
Right. It wasn't men who came up with thinspiration. Now, inspiration to lose more and more weight. It was young women. Now, of course, men get involved in all kinds of, bad behavior and encourage each other in all kinds of bad behavior. But this kind of socially spread self-harm has proven over and over to be endemic to young women.
You can't group antisocial males together when they're teenagers because they get worse. So that's well known. And in fact, if you take antisocial boys and you put them with pro-social boys, the pro-social boys become more antisocial. The antisocial boys don't get better. And that was discovered back in the 1930s in the Somerville study, the detrimental consequences of grouping antisocial boys together. It was the very large-scale study that was designed to, in principle, to reduce the risk of boys at risk for developing criminal behavior and alcoholism and so forth. It was one of the first longitudinal studies. It was a complete failure in that the treatment group, who were subject to all sorts of benevolent, at least in principle, benevolent interventions, did much worse than the control group. And after much painstaking analysis and heart-rending doubt, the study's authors concluded that housing the children together in the summer camps they had put out for them to get them out of the inner city was actually the cause of their increased pathology in adulthood. So it does happen among males. Now, Tumblr is also something that you discuss as a new mode of, perhaps a new medium of social contagion. And as far as I know, that's also a social media forum that's essentially female dominated. Is that correct?
I believe it is still, but though I have not, up to date on the latest, of who looks at Tumblr, but it always has been, yes, right. Predominantly female.
Right. So, all right. Here's another question. What made you convinced that you were qualified to do this? Because if I was a critic, again, I guess that's the next place that I would attack, right? Because you're not a mental health professional, and so it might be asked, what right do you have to investigate this even? That might be one question, but then also to draw conclusions.
Well, as I'm sure you saw, if when you read my book, I didn't draw any medical conclusions. That is, I relied entirely on experts. And I do believe it is a journalist's job to look into